As a teenager, Jennifer Pan was used to living with high expectations.
She was a straight-A student.
She was a good girl.
And her parents were determined to keep it that way.
It was a solid rule, no boys.
But when Jennifer met bad boy Daniel Wong, her parents' rule book went out the window.
They did things that Jennifer's family would have considered quite forbidden.
But their steamy love affair would be rocked when Jennifer and her family fell victim to a shocking act of violence.
911, Drew. Help me, please, I need help.
3 people came into the house. They had guns.
Now get the inside story of how police untangled this deadly web of deceit.
There were so many lies. They were lies upon lies.
And witness how investigators worked to track down a remorseless team of killers who were definitely playing for keeps.
2 shots right in the head.
That defies human comprehension.
November 8th, 2010. It was just after 10:30 p.m. in the usually peaceful town of Markham, Ontario, when emergency operators received an alarming phone call.
911, Drew. Help me, please, I need help. Ma'am, calm down. What's going on?
The caller identified herself as 24-year-old Jennifer Pan. Jennifer told the dispatcher that she and her parents had just fallen victim to a terrifying home invasion.
I'm broken and I heard shots like pops. I don't know what's happening. I'm tied upstairs. And I think my dad went outside and he's screaming.
You can hear in her voice just the panic.
Jennifer, who the men had tied to a banister upstairs, didn't know what had become of her mother, 53-year-old Bic Pan, or her father, 57-year-old Han Pan.
She didn't know if they were alive or not.
Police rushed to the home on Helen Avenue. Unsure whether or not the gunmen were still there, they carefully entered the Pan home. Inside, they found no sign of the attackers. But they did find Jennifer on the home's 2nd floor.
Jennifer was screaming to officers.
She's still tied up.
Police freed Jennifer and escorted her outside as a team of officers continued to search the home for any trace of her parents. Jennifer told police it all started just after 10 o'clock.
She'd been in her bedroom talking to a friend on the telephone when she heard this huge commotion.
Curious as to what was going on, Jennifer opened her bedroom door.
She came out and saw armed men and her parents at gunpoint.
While one man kept a gun pointed at Jennifer, the 2 others made it clear to her parents exactly what they'd come for.
There was demands for money. Where's the money? Where's the money?
At first, her parents seemed confused by the demand.
He only has about $60, he says, in his wallet.
But Jennifer said the offer only enraged the gunmen, and they took it out on her father.
He got pistol whipped. They were telling him to shut up.
One of the men then tied Jennifer to the upstairs balcony, while the other 2 ushered her parents away.
The intruders took her parents downstairs because they were not cooperating.
But what had happened to Jennifer's parents? And where were the attackers now? The answers to those questions would uncover a shocking tale of lust, deceit, and forbidden love. And a deadly plot hatched by desperate people who'd do anything to get what they wanted.
It's such a horrific crime. How could anyone be involved in this?
Born in 1986, Jennifer Pan was raised in the Toronto suburb of Markham.
Jennifer Pan's parents were Han and Bic Pan. They were from Vietnam. They came to Canada as refugees.
3 years after Jennifer was born, the Pan family welcomed a boy. Han and Bic made it clear to their children that the bar in the Pan household was set high.
They had high expectations for their children in school, achievements, academics, extracurriculars.
And Jennifer proved early on that she was capable of not only meeting her parents' expectations, but exceeding them.
She did well at school. She loved to play the piano. She loved to figure skate. She was a good girl.
But once in high school, Jennifer began having interests other than pleasing her parents.
She wanted a boyfriend.
It was a desire that Han Pan wasn't willing to entertain.
He wanted his children to be focused only on education.
She was not allowed to have any boyfriends.
Her parents' dating ban left Jennifer no alternative. If she wanted to flirt with boys, she had to do it during school hours. Pretty and smart, Jennifer found it easy to make male friends among her classmates. But as Jennifer focused more on boys instead of schoolwork, her grades began to suffer, if only slightly. Instead of making straight A's, she began making the occasional B. And while such a slight dip in grades would have gone unnoticed in other households, anything short of perfect was simply unacceptable to Jennifer's parents.
She had like average grades, but not as high as her parents would have wanted them.
While under her parents' roof, Jennifer was able to discreetly stay in touch with her school friends through emails and texts. But she knew that any further slide in her GPA might provoke her parents into scaling back or shutting off her phone and internet. The fear of being cut off led Jennifer to take a drastic step and began forging new grades.
She started copying and pasting her report card.
And while the Pans dreamed of their daughter one day being a highly paid professional, Jennifer had other ideas.
What she wanted to do was be a piano teacher. Music was like life to her.
So when her high school offered a trip to Europe to study music during her junior year, Jennifer begged her parents to let her go. Han and Bick relented. Once there, 16-year-old Jennifer was thrilled with the freedom.
Being in Europe and seeing all of the beauty and not having her parents monitoring her every single day was extraordinary on its own.
But while visiting Vienna, Jennifer's trip took a terrifying turn when she had a sudden and unexpected asthma attack.
She thought she was going to die.
That is, until a young man came to her rescue, a handsome senior from her school named Daniel Wong. Cool and composed, Daniel stayed close, gently reminding the terrified girl not to panic and to remain calm until the attack passed.
Prince Charming happened to be on hand. Daniel Wong.
Born in 1985 to Chinese-Filipino parents, Daniel Wong grew up just 20 minutes away from Jennifer in nearby Scarborough.
He's first generation, just like Jennifer Pan. He had a good upbringing.
But despite his upbringing, Bad Boy Daniel had a reputation as one of his high school's primary pot dealers.
He started, getting a few extra dollars here and there, slinging dope.
And Daniel's drug dealing made him a pretty popular figure in his high school.
And a lot of the times when you're a teenage boy, running with a bad crowd can work in your favor.
It was Daniel's unexpected compassion in her moment of need that won Jennifer over.
He stayed back with her and comforted her, and they had a real heart-to-heart moment.
A moment that left Jennifer feeling something she never had before.
Somebody saved her. For a young girl who is maturing and her hormones are surging, it must have felt just like love.
For the rest of their school trip, they remained inseparable. Daniel had loved playing the dashing hero, helping a damsel in distress. And for Jennifer, it felt like true love.
It is like a fairy tale, but I think a lot of teenage girls create fairy tales in their heads.
But once back in Markham, reality quickly set in. Jennifer's loyalty to her inflexible traditional family forced her to keep her relationship with Daniel a secret from her parents.
After, when they returned from Europe, when she went home, she was home for the entire night. Love can blossom only so much under those circumstances.
It wasn't long, however, before Jennifer and Daniel began sneaking around. But to their surprise, the young teenagers soon found that sneaking around only made their physical connection more intense.
They shared intimacy, and frankly, they did things that Jennifer's family would have considered quite forbidden.
They were both love-struck.
When Daniel graduated from high school, the couple made plans to attend college in Toronto just as soon as Jennifer graduated the following year.
It gives her an excuse to leave home and enable her to see Daniel as much as she wants.
When Jennifer's parents saw an envelope from prestigious Ryerson University in the mail, they hoped it was an acceptance letter. And when they opened the letter together with Jennifer, they were thrilled.
Jennifer was accepted to Ryerson University.
Before Jennifer moved to Toronto to attend freshman classes in the fall of 2010, the now 18-year-old made a promise to her parents. During the week, she would focus on her studies, and on weekends, she would make the 30-minute trip home to be with her family.
She's living with a friend, a roommate.
Every weekend, Jennifer returned home and shared stories with her proud parents about her classes, campus life, and the strides she was taking toward her degree.
What more could the parents ask for? She was coming home on the weekend. It looked as if all of their hard work and their strictness, their guidance was paying off.
But she left a detail or two out of her updates. In reality, Jennifer spent every school night in Toronto in an off-campus love nest with her secret lover, Daniel Wong.
You're 24. You don't need mommy and daddy to say yes to your boyfriend at this stage in your life.
But Jennifer knew she was taking a big risk. There was more at stake than just losing her parents' respect and trust if they found out she and Daniel were shacking up.
The bulk of her money came from her parents. Her parents were paying her way.
And since they were paying for their daughter's tuition and rent, Jennifer's parents thought it would be wise to check up on their investment by traveling up to Toronto. But when Jennifer's mom showed up unannounced one day, she saw something shocking.
One day, Jennifer's mom came to pick her up in North Toronto and spies Jennifer and Daniel saying goodbye, kissing.
Bick reported back to her husband what she had seen, and when Jennifer came home to visit that weekend, her enraged parents demanded that she come clean.
Finally, Jennifer admits she has a boyfriend. She's been making time to see Daniel.
Han and Bick were furious and laid down an ultimatum.
You have to come home and leave this guy.
Jennifer knew if she didn't obey her parents' wishes, she would be cut off from the family and their financial support. So she begrudgingly broke things off with Daniel and moved into her parents' home in Markham, where Jennifer's father laid down the law. Until she graduated, Jennifer would commute to and from college and spend her nights under her parents' roof. When she wasn't studying, she would start training in her major by working as a pharmacy technician at a local Walmart. Every waking hour would be accounted for. Jennifer was devastated.
Because she had to break up with Daniel, she was heartbroken and depressed that she was given all these restraints at home where she couldn't go out. She was essentially at home all the time. She said she felt like a prisoner.
But Jennifer was about to have much bigger problems than a broken heart. Little did her parents know that she was still hiding even more secrets than her recently severed romance with Daniel. And when her web of deceit completely unraveled, the fallout would be both shocking and deadly. Coming up, police make a terrifying discovery.
There was an excessive amount of blood. There was blood splatter on the walls.
And investigators race to separate truth from fiction.
There were so many lies. They were lies upon lies.
In the fall of 2010, 24-year-old Jennifer Pan was living her immigrant parents' dream as a freshman college student and begrudgingly holding up her side of their strict bargain. As long as her parents were footing the tuition bills, Jennifer was forbidden from dating.
It was a solid rule in the family. No boys.
It was a rule that Jennifer had recently been caught breaking. Months earlier, her parents had been shocked to learn that instead of studying in her dorm room, Jennifer had been spending her nights at an off-campus love nest she shared with her lover, Daniel Wong, the same boy she'd been secretly dating since high school.
And she was in love with him, and he was coming of age with her.
But Jennifer's parents had discovered the deception and issued an ultimatum: dump Daniel or else.
When they finally learn that Jennifer's led a double life, the father explodes. He forces her to live at home, cuts her off on all her money, forbids her from ever seeing Daniel. her life is turned upside down.
At first, Jennifer was heartbroken by having to break up with Daniel. But a few weeks of living under her father's new regimen seemed to help her readjust. But Han and Big Pan's satisfaction with their daughter's compliance was soon overshadowed when a sudden tragedy struck the family on the evening of November 8th, 2010.
911, Drew. Help me, please. I need help. I don't know where my parents are.
At just after 10:30 p.m., 911 dispatchers in Jennifer's hometown of Markham, Ontario, received a panicked call.
Someone broke in and I heard shots like pops. I don't know what's happening. I'm tied upstairs.
Jennifer reported that she was a captive in a home invasion in progress.
3 people came into the house. They were armed, they had guns.
She was tied up.
There was demands for money. Where's the money? Where's the money?
First responders found Jennifer tied to an upstairs banister, but no trace of the gunman or Jennifer's parents.
They see Jennifer, she's tied up.
They ran right up and cut her loose.
But when officers searched the basement, they made a gruesome discovery. Jennifer's mother, 53-year-old Big Pan, sprawled in a pool of blood.
Point blank range, 2 shots right in the head, and she's dead.
But where was Jennifer's father? Jennifer told police the last time she'd seen 57-year-old Han Pan was during her panicked 911 call.
Dad?
Jennifer claimed her father emerged from the basement alone, and from what Jennifer could see from where she'd been tied up, he was bloody and clearly wounded.
She's screaming out, "Dad, Dad, I'm upstairs."
But according to Jennifer, Han didn't hear her. Instead, she helplessly watched her injured father stagger out of their home, and she hadn't seen him since. Investigators immediately searched the neighborhood for Han Pan, and it didn't take them long to find him.
Mr. Pan was immediately next door in an open garage of the neighbors.
He was shot in the face, in the eye. He was also shot in the shoulder.
Miraculously, he's still alive.
But just barely. Paramedics quickly rushed him to a nearby hospital.
It wasn't clear whether or not he was going to survive.
Jennifer was also taken to the hospital for observation. Meanwhile, officers began searching the home for clues. When they took a closer look at Big Pan's body, they made note of a chilling detail.
The intruders had wrapped blankets around her head before they shot her.
And even though he'd survived the attack, it looked like the killers had attempted to do the same thing with Han Pan.
The intruders had forethought, which was, let's put blankets over their head so that the sound is muffled and blood doesn't splatter everywhere, including all over them.
To detectives, it was a sign they were dealing with experienced criminals, and had police second-guessing whether this home invasion was really a random armed robbery.
People don't just break into homes and shoot the residents. That just doesn't happen.
But that wasn't the only clue that had police questioning whether money had been the true motive behind the attack.
There were 2 luxury cars left in the garage and not stolen. There was a safe that was untouched.
Also untouched was $200 cash inside Big's purse.
They also found her wallet and her purse on the kitchen counter.
It was clear there was more to this crime than a simple robbery gone wrong. But what had the killers really been after? Police knew only 2 people who could possibly shed light on that question: Han and Jennifer Pan. But police soon received word that at least one of those people wouldn't be talking anytime soon.
Mr. Pan did go into surgery. Following that surgery, he was placed into a medically induced coma.
Jennifer Pan, however, had been given the all clear to be questioned.
She was cleared at the hospital, and she returned to the police station, and she gave a statement to the police.
Jennifer told police that she'd been in her bedroom talking to a friend on the phone when she heard loud voices downstairs.
She'd been in her bedroom talking to a friend on the telephone when she heard this huge commotion. She came out and saw armed men and her parents at gunpoint.
Jennifer said one of the men spotted her and ordered her to the living room as the other gunman made demands.
Where is the money? Show me where your money is.
Jennifer said she watched helplessly as the gunman attacked her father. And once she was tied to the upstairs balcony, the masked men led her parents into the basement at gunpoint. Then Jennifer said she heard a terrifying sound.
Then I heard 2 pops. My mom screamed. I yelled out for her. And a couple more pops.
The masked men emerged from the basement and fled the house. That's when Jennifer said she finally was able to call for help.
She had a phone that was tucked into the back of her yoga pants.
Even though she was tied up, she said that she could reach around and pull the cell phone out, and that's how she called 911.
Prompted for a description of the attackers, Jennifer had little to offer.
She was saying 3 males. Her descriptions at that point were vague.
I don't remember any of his clothing, unfortunately. The only thing I can remember was he had dreadlocks.
Investigators immediately put the description of the suspects out over the airwaves. But no sooner had they issued the APB than they would get word that someone else wanted to provide a statement about the attack at the Pan household. And what they said would not only contradict Jennifer's statement, it would turn the entire case on its head. Coming up, police get a surprise statement from an unexpected witness.
It definitely changed the course of the investigation.
And new evidence focuses the investigation on Jennifer's supposedly former romance with Daniel Wong.
He sees her standing there whispering as if it's to a friend.
By the fall of 2010, 24-year-old Jennifer Pan was a hardworking and committed college student who obeyed her parents' strict mandate forbidding her from dating for as long as they were paying her tuition. She'd even broken up with her once secret boyfriend, 25-year-old Daniel Wong, after her parents learned of their relationship and ordered that she terminate it.
When Jennifer got an ultimatum from her parents, making her choose between them and Daniel, on the surface, she chose them. She moved on fairly quickly. But at that point, other things in her life were also picking up.
But tragedy had struck the Pan household on November 8th, when Jennifer and her parents were victims of a brutal home invasion that took a devastating toll.
Her mother has been fatally wounded.
Mr. Pan, he's been shot in the eye and in the shoulder, but he's not quite dead.
Unfortunately, Jennifer hadn't been able to provide much of a description of the home invaders. But detectives soon received an unexpected break when they learned that Jennifer's father, Han, had finally woken up from his medically induced coma.
His head is all bandaged up. He's still in a ton of pain. And within a couple hours, police are talking to him.
As police listened, Han provided the horrifying details of what had happened in the basement.
He has a blanket put over his head, and his wife is executed in front of him.
Han Pan was then shot twice, but managed to survive. After being shot, Han said he fainted. Moments later, he regained consciousness and in a panic, fled to the neighbor's house in search of help. And while most of Han's story lined up with Jennifer's description, Han did reveal a surprising new piece of the puzzle to investigators. The masked attackers weren't strangers, at least not to Jennifer.
She was talking to some of the intruders. They were actually very nice to her.
He sees her standing there whispering as if it's to a friend.
Investigators began to wonder, had Han misunderstood what he'd seen? Or was it possible Jennifer was hiding something? When police asked Han, he told them that his daughter was used to hiding things. But Han explained that he and his wife had recently uncovered an even more shocking betrayal than their daughter's former secret relationship with Daniel. Soon after Jennifer moved back home, Han began to sense she wasn't giving him the whole story of how she was spending her days. With his daughter's credibility already hanging by a thread, Han demanded proof that Jennifer was living up to her part of the deal. He primarily wanted to know if she was reporting to the pharmacy tech job he made her apply for at the Walmart after moving back home.
He really wanted just confirmation that she was working.
He brought her to the computer and said, log into your online banking and show me the money transfer from Walmart to your bank account.
But Jennifer had no bank transfers to show. Tearfully, she admitted to her parents that she had lied to them and had never even applied for the job. And that wasn't all she lied about.
Everything starts pouring out. There is no job. Not only is there no job, she didn't go to Ryerson University.
Jennifer confessed that she had never attended a single class in Toronto. She wasn't even enrolled. But what about the acceptance letter Jennifer's parents had been so happy about? Han told police that the acceptance letter had been a fake, forged by Jennifer.
She had all these fake report cards and went pre-acceptance into Ryerson.
But why would the driven high school grad have had to resort to a forgery? Han told police it was because Jennifer had never applied to college, because she couldn't. Jennifer had never graduated from high school.
She had to come clean and saying, well, actually, I never even graduated from high school. I was 1 credit short.
Jennifer spent $500 to buy a phony diploma.
Han and Bick were completely blindsided by Jennifer's deceptions and betrayals. But Han told police that didn't stop them from giving their daughter one final chance to get her life back on track.
They said, we'll enroll you in school and we'll pay for it and we'll support you.
Her life was to be this tiny circuit of being monitored by her parents and finishing her education.
And inside that tiny circuit, Han made it clear there would be no room for Daniel Wong.
He's told her that if she wanted to be with Daniel, then she would have to wait until he was dead.
According to Han, Jennifer accepted the offer. She registered for classes and began college for real this time. But what made him most happy was that more than a year after she moved home, there was still no sign of Daniel Wong re-entering his daughter's life.
He felt like he had his family back.
But investigators couldn't help but wonder, was it possible that while Jennifer had been playing by Han's rules, could Daniel Wong have been crafting a deadly plan to get rid of the one obstacle that stood between him and Jennifer being together?
I think Daniel Wong still had feelings for her.
Investigators immediately tracked Daniel down at work and brought him in for questioning. The 25-year-old quickly admitted that his history with Jennifer's parents was complicated.
He articulated that the parents never liked him. They never liked the relationship.
A relationship Daniel insisted had come to an end with Han's final ultimatum.
It was no longer a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship.
Her parents didn't want us to be, her family didn't want us to be together. And I respected that decision and I moved on.
Therefore, Daniel insisted he had no reason whatsoever to attack the Pans. And he claimed he could prove it.
Daniel Wong was at Boston Pizza working, counting inventory the night of the murder.
Daniel's alibi checked out, which left police no choice but to let him go and admit they were back at square one.
There was 3 unknown suspects.
That's really all there is.
But little did investigators know that this case was about to heat back up and take off in a whole new direction. A direction that would bring new leads, introduce new suspects, and uncover more deadly secrets. Coming up, as police dig relentlessly into her romantic past, Jennifer is pushed to the brink of self-destruction.
Without Daniel, life just wasn't worth living, she said.
And shocking new details about the night of the attack recast Jennifer's role from innocent bystander to intended target.
The hit wasn't for her parents, it was for her.
By the fall of 2010, detectives in Markham, Ontario had just discovered that 24-year-old Jennifer Pan had been carrying on an obsessive and secret romance with 25-year-old Daniel Wong behind her parents' backs. And now that Jennifer's mother had been killed and her father gravely injured in a violent home invasion, police were wondering what role the couple's deceptive history might have played in the attacks. It was a theory that had been bolstered when Jennifer's father told detectives about a peculiar observation from the night of the attack.
Han Pan saw Jennifer speaking softly, in his words, to one of the intruders.
He says that she seemed to actually know the intruders.
To cops, if Jennifer knew one of the attackers, it made sense that it would be Daniel Wong. But it turned out that Daniel Wong had an alibi for the night of the crime, which left detectives wondering, if it hadn't been Daniel, who had Jennifer been talking to? Intent on finding out, police hauled Jennifer back in for questioning and wasted no time in letting her know that she had been moved from victim to suspect.
They gave her some pointed questions.
She was sobbing. They were putting the pressure on her, saying, like, Jennifer, like, you hired those people. Like, they came in that house to kill your parents. And she's saying, no.
The move worked. Jennifer broke down and admitted she not only knew the gunmen, she hired them.
She set this whole thing up and she paid for it, but it had gone terribly wrong, she said.
But that's when Jennifer told detectives something they didn't expect. Jennifer claimed she hadn't hired the gunmen to kill her parents. Instead, she'd hired them to go after a different target, herself.
She was to be assassinated. The hit wasn't for her parents, it was for her.
She wanted these men to kill her.
A tearful Jennifer told detectives that while Han may have believed she'd gotten her life back on track after being forced to break up with Daniel, she'd actually spent the last few months slipping into a deep depression.
She'd been exposed as a liar and a thief. She had absolutely no education, hadn't even finished high school. As far as she was concerned, she was the walking dead. She just needed somebody to kill her.
She was never going to live up to her parents' standards, and because of that, she felt that there was no reason to keep on living.
And while confronting her failures had been painful, there was something else that pushed her from depression to suicidal. She learned that her beloved ex-boyfriend, Daniel Wong, had moved on.
Daniel Wong had moved on before the murder, at least a year before, with a new girlfriend.
Jennifer believed that that was the end of her life. Without Daniel, life just wasn't worth living, she said.
Jennifer wanted to die, but she didn't want to further shame her parents with suicide. So she came up with a unique solution.
She hired someone to come kill her so that it would look like she was murdered.
Through a friend, Jennifer said she found a man downtown who claimed he could arrange the hit. The man went by the name Homeboy, and Jennifer only spoke to him over the phone. Homeboy told Jennifer that he could have her killed by 3 gunmen in a staged home invasion. Jennifer said they then agreed on a price of $2,000 and scheduled the hit for the night of November 8th. When that night finally arrived, Jennifer did her part to set the plan in motion.
By her own admission, she unlocked the door to let the intruders in.
But Jennifer said as she waited for her assassins to arrive, it wasn't long before she began to have second thoughts.
She says that she decided to call off this.
But just after 10 p.m. that night, the gunman showed up anyway. It seemed that despite her cancellation, the hitmen still wanted to get paid.
They asked, where's the money? We want money.
Jennifer told police she handed over $2,000, not only the agreed upon price, but all the money she had. But she claimed the gunmen weren't satisfied. They told her they wanted more, at least $10,000. It was money that Jennifer told the men she didn't have. That angered the hitmen, and to show their dismay, they shot both her parents before fleeing the house.
She never intended for her parents to be murdered.
Jennifer's confession certainly caught detectives off guard and left them with several questions. For starters, who was the Homeboy character that had arranged the hit? According to Jennifer, she'd only been given his nickname and a phone number. But in the chaos since the shooting, she'd forgotten the number and could only recall 3 of the digits.
She indicated she contacted a phone number with 856.
Investigators asked Jennifer for her phone, which they handed off to technology experts to hopefully identify Homeboy's number based on the digits Jennifer had provided. It wasn't long before they hit pay dirt.
Police made the determination that the 856 number was a phone registered to Lenford Roy Crawford.
It was a name that instantly rang a bell to police.
Lenford Crawford was working as a part-time mechanic, moving small amounts of marijuana to people that wanted it in the city.
Investigators wasted no time in tracking Lenford Crawford down. When pressed, he admitted that he knew Jennifer Pan, and just as Jennifer said, they had been introduced through a mutual friend. The name of that friend, 25-year-old Daniel Wong. According to Linford, he knew Daniel from back when he was dealing pot in high school. But when police asked Linford if he helped Jennifer hire the gunman that attacked her family, Linford denied knowing anything about it.
He told the police that she never, ever asked him to help kill her parents. She never asked him to kill herself.
And just like Daniel Wong, Linford tried to prove his innocence by providing an alibi for the night of the crime.
On that day, he was at work from 3 p.m. to 12 o'clock.
But police remained convinced that there was more to the connection between Linford Crawford, Daniel Wong, and Jennifer Pan than any of them were willing to admit. So investigators began combing through the phone records of all 3. They paid particularly close attention to the trio's text messages and soon discovered that contrary to what they told both their parents and police, Jennifer and Daniel's romance was far from over.
They were still using pet names with each other and saying they would always be there for each other.
Jennifer and Daniel's text messages also revealed a disturbing pattern that began taking place in the late summer of 2010. It was at that time that both Daniel and Jennifer began making frequent contact with Linford Crawford, along with 2 other men, 31-year-old David Milvaganam and 22-year-old Eric Carty. The messages were intentionally cryptic, but detectives soon keyed in on several exchanges that seemed to revolve around a suspicious subject.
And there was these text messages that said 10 stacks.
Their urban street language expert said they were talking about a $10,000 payment for the murder of 2 people. There was one text message, if you do both, 10 for you.
So 5,000 for Big Pan, 5,000 for Hand Pan.
To police, it was physical proof that Jennifer and Daniel had hired Linford Crawford to contract out the double murder of Jennifer's parents. Linford then hired the hitmen to commit the crime.
Eric Carty and David Mulvagnan and an unknown person were the ones who perpetrated the murder.
Following the discovery of the text messages, police placed Jennifer Pan, Daniel Wong, and Linford Crawford under arrest, along with Eric Carty and David Milvaganam. All 5 faced the same list of charges.
First-degree murder related to Big Pan and the attempted murder of Hand Pan.
Prosecutors felt they had more than enough evidence to convict all 5 conspirators. But if Jennifer and Daniel had proved anything, it was that they both had a talent for hiding the truth. And the true depths of their deception had yet to be seen. Coming up, Jennifer Pan's murder trial begins with a shocking revelation.
She could collect $500,000.
But would it be enough to sway a jury? By the spring of 2014, years of secrets and lies had come to a head for lovers Daniel Wong and Jennifer Pan. The pair was charged with planning the murder and attempted murder of Jennifer's parents, Han and Bick, along with alleged conspirators Linford Crawford, Eric Carty, and David Milvaganam.
So everybody's facing the same charge. It's first-degree murder and attempted murder.
As for motive, Police believe that Jennifer and Daniel had planned the murders because her father, Han, had forbidden Jennifer from seeing Daniel.
Her father gave her an ultimatum. You can go off and be with Daniel, but you can never come back. Jennifer took her father's threats as literal, I guess. You know, if I can't be with him until you're dead, then I'm gonna kill you.
Prosecutors decided to try Jennifer, Daniel, Linford, and David at the same time. And as proceedings began on March 19, 2014, prosecutors revealed that while Jennifer may have been desperate to be with Daniel, there was something else she also desired.
The motive of the murders was twofold. One, so that Jennifer Pan could continue her relationship with Daniel Wong, and secondly, so she could collect her inheritance. She could collect $500,000 and live comfortably with her boyfriend.
It was a stunning accusation, and one the defense tried to combat by calling Jennifer herself to testify. From the witness stand, Jennifer stuck by the story she'd given police.
She'd hired the hitman to come in to make it look like a home invasion and kill her. And then it went terribly wrong.
But would the jury believe her? On December 13th, the jury came back with the same verdict for Jennifer and all three of her co-defendants.
They were all found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder.
They were all sentenced to life in prison without parole for 25 years on both charges.
While the sentence put an official end to Jennifer and Daniel's web of lies, it didn't make the brazen nature of their crimes easier to accept.
You have a daughter orchestrating the murder of her own parents for love and for money. That defies human comprehension.
But what is easily understandable is that Jennifer's dream of being with Daniel will never come true.
She's now facing at least 25 years in jail, and she won't be serving it with Daniel Wong.
On the morning of May 24th, 2022, Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, was a place defined by everything ordinary about a school day. Children were inside their classrooms. Teachers were doing their work. Families were going about the routines of a normal morning. Nothing about the building itself suggested that, before the day was over, it would become the scene of one of the most devastating school shootings in American history. But shortly before noon, that ordinary world was shattered. An 18-year-old named Salvador Rolando Ramos entered the school carrying a semi-automatic rifle and wearing body armor. He moved toward classrooms 111 and 112, two rooms connected to one another, and began shooting. In the minutes that followed, children and teachers were trapped inside, while a growing number of law enforcement officers arrived outside and inside the school. The gunfire was real. The danger was real. And yet the most enduring question from Uvalde would not simply be how Ramos entered the school or why he opened fire. It would be why, after officers had already arrived, the threat remained inside for so long. Approximately 77 minutes passed between the arrival of the first officers and the moment Ramos was finally confronted and killed. 77 minutes. In an active shooter situation, time is not an abstract measurement. It is something that can separate danger from rescue, uncertainty from action, and survival from death. The tragedy at Robb Elementary would eventually become a story not only about a gunman, but about leadership, command, communication, tactics, training, and the consequences of failing to recognize what was happening in front of you. Later, the United States Department of Justice would describe the law enforcement response as a failure. Its review concluded that serious problems in leadership, incident command, communication, tactical decision-making, and training contributed to the response. But before those conclusions were written into a federal report, before thousands of pieces of evidence were examined, before the events of that day were reconstructed through cameras, recordings, communications, photographs, interviews, and official documents, there was only the unfolding emergency itself. At approximately 11:33 a.m., Ramos entered Robb Elementary and began firing into rooms 111 and 112. Inside were students and teachers who had no reason to expect that their school day would become a fight for survival. The attack unfolded rapidly. Ramos was armed with an AR-15 style rifle and was wearing body armor. Within minutes, law enforcement officers were arriving. According to the later Department of Justice review, 11 officers from the Uvalde School District Police Force and the Uvalde Police Department were inside the school within the first few minutes. 5 officers moved toward rooms 111 and 112 after hearing gunfire. Ramos fired from inside. 2 officers were injured by fragments, and the officers moved back toward positions of cover. That moment would become one of the defining turning points of the entire case. The officers had initially moved toward the sound of gunfire. But after Ramos fired at them, the response began to change. Instead of maintaining the understanding that this was an active shooter situation, the incident increasingly came to be treated as though the gunmen were barricaded inside the classroom. The distinction was critical. An active shooter represents an immediate and continuing threat, requiring officers to move toward the threat in order to stop it and allow victims to be rescued. A barricaded subject is understood differently. The suspect is perceived as contained, and the tactical response can become slower and more deliberate. The later federal review concluded that failing to maintain the active shooter mindset was a fundamental error. And while officers remained outside the classroom, the people inside were still there. Children and teachers had not simply disappeared from the equation because the gunfire had temporarily stopped. They remained trapped in a place where the attacker was still present. One student called 911. According to the Department of Justice review, that call lasted approximately 16 minutes, and the student provided information to authorities. That detail is central to understanding Uvalde. The existence of a survivor inside the classroom meant that the emergency was not merely theoretical. There were still people alive inside. There was still information coming from inside. There was still a threat that had not been eliminated. Yet the rescue did not happen immediately. As additional officers arrived, another problem became increasingly apparent: the absence of a clear and unified understanding of who was in command and what was actually happening inside the classroom. Questions that should have had clear answers became part of the confusion. Who was in charge? What did officers know? Was Ramos still alive? Had someone already entered the room? Why had the response stopped? The later investigation found that some officers believed Ramos had already been killed or that officers were already inside the classroom with him. The confusion was not merely a matter of perception. It affected the decisions being made in real time. Then, at approximately 12:21 p.m., nearly 50 minutes after the first officers arrived, 4 more shots were fired from inside the classroom. The significance of those 4 shots is difficult to ignore. They demonstrated that Ramos was still alive and still capable of using his weapon while officers remained outside. The emergency had not ended. The threat had not disappeared. Yet the response continued without the immediate intervention that would eventually occur. The minutes continued to pass. More law enforcement personnel arrived. More resources became available. But the fundamental problems of command, communication, and understanding remained. Approximately 75 minutes after the first officers arrived, law enforcement finally entered room 111. The final confrontation was brief compared with the long period that preceded it. Officers entered. Ramos fired toward them. The officers returned fire. Ramos was killed. By the time the immediate threat was finally eliminated, approximately 77 minutes had passed since the first officers arrived at Robb Elementary. But the end of the gunfire did not mean the end of the tragedy. 21 people had been killed, 19 children and 2 teachers. Others were injured, including students, teachers, and law enforcement officers. Families outside the school had been left waiting for information about the people they loved. Survivors would carry the consequences of the event long after the gunfire ended. And the question that would follow Uvalde was not one that could be answered simply by naming Salvador Ramos. Ramos was the person who directly carried out the attack, and responsibility for the killings rests with him. But the federal investigation would examine another question. What happened during those 77 minutes, and how did the response fail so badly? The Department of Justice would later spend 54 days in Uvalde and interview more than 260 people. Investigators would examine more than 14,000 pieces of data and documents, including security camera footage, body camera footage, audio recordings, photographs, training records, agency policies, investigative records, witness statements, communications data, and medical and emergency response documentation. Their task was to reconstruct what had happened step by step and to compare the evidence against the accounts that had emerged in the aftermath. The resulting report, released on January 18, 2024, described the law enforcement response as a failure. It identified problems involving leadership, incident command, communication, tactics, training, and delayed action. The report did not reduce the disaster to one isolated mistake. Instead, it presented a chain of failures that unfolded during an emergency in which children and teachers remained trapped with an active shooter. This is why the story of Uvalde cannot be told only as the story of Salvador Ramos. If the narrative begins and ends with the gunman, then the most important question remains unanswered. The story is also about the 19 children and 2 teachers who never came home. It is about the students and teachers who survived. It is about families waiting outside while time passed. It is about the officers who arrived, the decisions they made, the information they had, and the command structure that failed to produce a unified response. And above all, it is about 77 minutes that would become inseparable from the memory of Robb Elementary. 77 minutes in which the outcome was still unfolding. 77 minutes in which the difference between knowing there was danger and acting upon that knowledge became painfully clear. Uvalde would leave behind no simple explanation, no single sentence capable of making sense of the tragedy. Instead, it would leave a timeline, a collection of evidence, 21 lives lost, survivors carrying the aftermath, and a question that would remain at the center of every investigation that followed. When the threat is already inside, when people are still alive, and when the people who can intervene are already there, what happens when the response loses sight of what the emergency truly is? Before the events at Robb Elementary School became a national tragedy, Salvador Rolando Ramos was an 18-year-old living in Uvalde, Texas. That description is deliberately simple. It is important because the temptation, after an event of this magnitude, is to search backward through a person's life and arrange every troubling detail into a neat explanation. But the facts provided about Ramos do not offer such a simple answer. There were concerning elements in his personal and social life. There were troubling things associated with his activity on social media. There were circumstances that, viewed after the attack, appeared disturbing. Yet none of those details alone explains what happened on May 24, 2022. The story of Ramos before Robb Elementary is therefore not a story with one clear cause. It is a story of warning signs, preparation, weapons, and a final sequence of events that moved from a private conflict inside a home to a public catastrophe at an elementary school. Ramos was 18 years old, an age that would become significant because he was legally old enough under federal law to purchase a rifle. According to the information provided, he legally purchased an AR-15 style rifle after reaching the relevant federal age. He later purchased additional firearms and ammunition. Those purchases matter because they demonstrate preparation, but they do not by themselves establish why he ultimately chose a school as the location of the attack. It is important to keep those distinctions clear. The fact that someone acquires weapons is not, on its own, an explanation for a future crime. In Ramos's case, however, the weapons became part of the sequence that culminated at Robb Elementary. The supplied information also notes that Ramos had experienced instability in his personal and social life and had posted concerning material on social media. These details became relevant after the attack because investigators and the public naturally wanted to understand whether there had been signs that something was wrong. But hindsight can be misleading. Once a terrible event has occurred, earlier behavior can appear more significant because people already know the outcome. That is why any serious account of Ramos has to resist the urge to transform every troubling detail into a prediction. The information available here does not establish one simple motive, and it does not justify reducing the attack to a single explanation, such as mental illness, online violence, or a personal conflict. What can be established is that by May 24th, Ramos possessed the weapons that would later be used in the attack, and that his actions that morning would set in motion the events at Robb Elementary. The morning began not at the school, but at Ramos's home in Uvalde. There, near the end of the morning, an argument occurred between Ramos and his grandmother, Irma Garcia. The conflict became violent. Ramos shot his grandmother, seriously injuring her. She survived. That moment marked a decisive change in the chain of events. Until then, the danger was contained within a private setting. Afterward, Ramos left the house. He got into a pickup truck and drove away. The information supplied does not establish every thought that passed through his mind during this period, nor does it provide a detailed account of his intentions between leaving the house and reaching the school. Those gaps matter. A responsible reconstruction should not fill them with speculation. What is known is that the pickup truck eventually crashed near Robb Elementary School. The crash brought Ramos physically close to the school. He left the vehicle carrying a firearm and moved toward the campus. At this point, the sequence that had begun with a confrontation at home was about to become a mass casualty attack. The setting was an elementary school. Inside were children and teachers. It was not a place where anyone expected to encounter an armed attacker. That contrast would later become one of the most painful aspects of the case. A school is ordinarily associated with lessons, classrooms, teachers, and children. On that morning, it became the location of an emergency that would eventually claim 21 lives. At approximately 11:33 a.m., Ramos entered Robb Elementary School. He moved toward rooms 111 and 112, two classrooms that were connected to one another. He began firing. The attack was no longer a threat that might happen. It was happening. Ramos was armed with a semi-automatic rifle and wearing body armor. The people inside the classrooms were suddenly confronted with an immediate and deadly danger. From this point onward, the story becomes a reconstruction of time. Every minute matters because the people inside were not simply passive figures in a distant event. They were students and teachers trapped inside the school while the response developed around them. Outside and throughout the school, law enforcement officers began arriving. Within the first few minutes, according to the later Department of Justice review, 11 officers from the Uvalde School District Police Force and the Uvalde Police Department were inside the school. 5 moved toward rooms 111 and 112 after hearing gunfire. Their approach was met by fire from inside. 2 officers were injured by fragments, and the officers withdrew toward positions of cover. This moment would later become central to the investigation because it marked the point where the immediate response changed. The officers had moved toward the sound of gunfire, but after being fired upon, the situation increasingly came to be treated as though Ramos were barricaded inside the classroom rather than as an active shooter whose threat remained immediate. That distinction would have enormous consequences. Yet at the time, the people making decisions did not have the benefit of hindsight. They were confronted with noise, incomplete information, danger, and an evolving situation. The later federal review, however, would examine those decisions from a broader perspective and conclude that the active shooter mindset should have been maintained. The tragedy of Uvalde, therefore, cannot be understood simply by asking what Ramos did before the attack. It also requires examining what happened after he entered the school and how the institutions responding to him interpreted the situation. Still, the beginning of that story remains with the choices Ramos made. He had been living in Uvalde. He had displayed troubling behavior and concerning social media activity. He had obtained firearms and ammunition. On the morning of May 24th, he became involved in a violent confrontation with his grandmother, shot her, and left the home. His vehicle crashed near Robb Elementary. He then approached the school carrying a firearm. At approximately 11:33 a.m., he entered and opened fire. From that moment, the private history of an 18-year-old became inseparable from the public tragedy of a community. But even here, there is a danger in focusing too heavily on Ramos. The more attention given to his identity, the easier it becomes to allow the victims to disappear behind the name of the perpetrator. The people inside Robb Elementary were not there because they had chosen to become part of a national story. They were students and teachers beginning another school day. Their lives were defined by families, friendships, classrooms, and ordinary routines that existed long before May 24th and should not be reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. Ramos made the decision to bring violence into that environment. The responsibility for the attack belongs to him. But the story that followed his entry into the school would raise another set of questions. Questions that could not be answered by examining his background alone. How quickly did officers understand what was happening? What did they know about the people trapped inside? Who was directing the response? Why did the incident begin to be treated as a barricaded subject situation? And why would approximately 77 minutes pass before the threat was finally eliminated? Those questions belong to the next stage of the story. Ramos's background provides the beginning of the timeline, but it does not provide its conclusion. The decisive chapter was about to unfold inside Robb Elementary, where the first officers were already moving toward the classrooms, where gunfire had already been heard, and where children and teachers were still waiting for help. At approximately 11:33 a.m. on May 24th, 2022, the story of Robb Elementary changed in a matter of moments. Until then, it had been an ordinary school environment in Uvalde, Texas, a place where children and teachers were inside classrooms, and the rhythm of the school day continued as usual. Then Salvador Ramos entered the building. He was 18 years old, carrying a semi-automatic rifle and wearing body armor. He moved toward rooms 111 and 112, two classrooms connected to one another, and began firing. With those first shots, the situation became an active and immediate emergency. The people inside the classrooms were suddenly confronted with a gunman, and the school became the center of a crisis that would eventually leave 21 people dead, including 19 children and 2 teachers. The first minutes are essential to understanding what happened afterward because they establish something that would remain true throughout the incident. This was not an emergency in which authorities were unaware that violence was taking place. The sound of gunfire provided an immediate indication that something was seriously wrong. Law enforcement officers began arriving quickly. According to the later Department of Justice review, 11 officers from the Uvalde School District Police Force and the Uvalde Police Department were inside the school within the first few minutes. Their arrival meant that the response was already beginning while the attack was still unfolding. 5 officers moved toward rooms 111 and 112 after hearing the gunfire. Their movement toward the classrooms represented the initial attempt to reach the source of the threat. But as they approached, Ramos fired from inside. The officers were met with gunfire, and 2 officers were injured by fragments. The officers then moved back toward positions of cover. That decision would later become one of the most important moments in the entire reconstruction of the attack. The officers had encountered an armed attacker who was firing from inside the classroom. They had also encountered a situation in which they did not yet possess a complete picture of what was happening behind the doors. The later federal review would examine what happened from that point forward and conclude that the Response failed to maintain the appropriate active shooter mindset. But at the moment itself, the situation was unfolding rapidly, and the officers had incomplete information. Inside rooms 111 and 112, the people who had been caught in the attack remained in danger. The fact that the officers had moved away from the classrooms did not mean that the threat had ended. Ramos was still inside. Students and teachers were still inside. The emergency therefore continued, even as the immediate tactical response began to change. This distinction would become central to the tragedy. In an active shooter situation, the continuing presence of the attacker means that the danger remains immediate. The objective is to reach the threat and stop it so that victims can be rescued. But after the initial exchange of gunfire, the situation increasingly came to be treated as though Ramos were a barricaded subject. That change in perception affected the pace and character of the response. The later Department of Justice review identified this as a fundamental problem. The officers were no longer operating from one clear understanding of the emergency. Instead, the response became increasingly complicated by uncertainty about what was happening inside the classrooms and by uncertainty about who was directing the overall operation. More officers arrived. More personnel became involved. Yet the growing number of people at the scene did not automatically produce a clearer response. One of the most important questions to emerge later was the question of command. Who was actually in charge? What did the officers know about the situation inside? Was Ramos still alive? Had someone already entered the room? Why had the response stopped? These were not questions that belonged only to an investigation conducted months later. They reflected the confusion that existed during the incident itself. The later review found that some officers believed Ramos had already been killed or that officers were already inside the classroom with him. Such beliefs were profoundly important because decisions made during an emergency depend on the information available to the people making them. If officers believed that the attacker had already been neutralized, their understanding of the situation would be entirely different from the reality described by the evidence. And the reality was that Ramos remained inside. The threat had not disappeared. The people inside had not been rescued. The school remained an active crime scene and an ongoing emergency. One of the clearest indications that the situation remained active came through a 911 call made by a student inside the classroom. According to the Department of Justice review, the student remained on the call for approximately 16 minutes and provided information to authorities. The existence of that call was significant because it meant that authorities were receiving information from someone who was inside the affected classroom. There were still survivors. There were still people who needed help. The passage of time, therefore, carried a different meaning than it might have in an ordinary police operation. Every minute represented additional time during which those inside remained exposed to the danger. Yet the response did not immediately transition into a rescue operation. Instead, officers continued to gather, communicate, assess, and wait while the command structure remained unclear. This is where the Uvalde timeline becomes increasingly difficult to comprehend. Officers had arrived within minutes. 5 had initially moved toward the classrooms. They had encountered gunfire and retreated. More officers continued to arrive. A student was communicating with 911, and still, the final entry into room 111 had not occurred. The central problem was no longer simply getting officers to the school. They were already there. It was no longer simply identifying where the attacker was. The location was known. The problem had become one of interpretation, command, communication, and action. What was happening inside those rooms? Was the attacker still capable of shooting? Were there survivors? What should officers do next? These questions would later become part of a much broader federal examination. The Department of Justice would review security camera footage, body camera footage, audio recordings, photographs, training records, agency policies, investigative records, witness statements, communications data, and medical and emergency response documentation. But on the morning of May 24th, none of those future investigative tools existed in a completed form. Officers were working in real time, within an evolving emergency, and the consequences of their decisions would be measured in lives. The first stage of the incident, therefore, contains a painful contradiction. Law enforcement did respond quickly. Officers were inside the school within minutes. They moved toward the classrooms. They encountered Ramos. But the initial movement toward the threat did not become a sustained effort to reach and stop him. Instead, after the officers were fired upon, the response slowed and became increasingly uncertain. The situation was gradually treated as a barricaded subject incident, even though the gunman remained inside with students and teachers. That shift would become one of the defining findings of the later Department of Justice review. At approximately 11:33 a.m., Ramos had entered the school and begun firing. Within minutes, officers were present. Yet the attack would not end within those first minutes. The clock would continue moving forward. The number of officers would grow. The questions surrounding command would become more significant. And somewhere inside the school, the people who had survived the initial gunfire were still waiting. The next crucial moment would come at approximately 12:21 p.m., when 4 additional shots were fired from inside the classroom. Those shots would provide stark evidence that the threat was still alive and that the emergency had not become a harmless standoff. Nearly 50 minutes after the first officers arrived, Ramos was still capable of firing his weapon. The meaning of those 4 shots would become central to understanding everything that followed. They demonstrated that the danger had not ended simply because the initial exchange of gunfire was over. They demonstrated that the people inside were still trapped with an armed attacker. And they raised, again, the question that would haunt the investigation long after the school was secured. Why had the response not yet reached the room? The answer would not be found in one decision alone. It would emerge from a chain of failures involving leadership, command, communication, tactics, and training. But before investigators could analyze that chain, the clock had to continue running. At Robb Elementary, the minutes between 11:33 and 12:21 were no longer simply units of time. They were the beginning of the 77-minute period that would define Uvalde. The first officers who entered Robb Elementary did something that, at first glance, appeared straightforward. They moved toward the sound of gunfire. They knew there was an armed person inside the school. They knew the danger was concentrated around rooms 111 and 112. They had heard the shots, and they moved toward the classrooms. But the response changed when Salvador Ramos fired from inside. 2 officers were injured by fragments, and the officers moved back toward positions of cover. That moment became the beginning of a much longer delay. The later Department of Justice review would identify the failure to maintain an active shooter mindset as one of the fundamental problems in the response. To understand why that mattered, it is necessary to understand the difference between recognizing a threat and understanding the nature of that threat. Ramos was not simply a person who had locked himself inside a room. He was an armed attacker who had already opened fire inside an elementary school. Students and teachers remained inside the affected classrooms. The threat had not been removed. The emergency was still unfolding. Yet after the initial confrontation, the situation increasingly came to be treated as though Ramos were a barricaded subject. In a barricaded subject situation, officers may perceive that the suspect has been contained and that there is time to establish a perimeter, gather information, coordinate resources, and determine how to proceed. But the circumstances at Robb Elementary were fundamentally different. There were children and teachers inside with the attacker. The later federal review concluded that the response should have continued to treat the incident as an active shooter situation. The distinction was not simply a matter of terminology. It affected how quickly officers believed they needed to act. It affected the urgency of the response, and it affected the decisions that followed. The most painful aspect of the Uvalde timeline is that the officers were not waiting for information about whether there was a threat somewhere in the school. They already knew there had been gunfire. They knew where the gunfire had originated, and they had already encountered the attacker. The uncertainty was different. It concerned what was happening inside the rooms and what should happen next. That uncertainty became increasingly tied to a second problem: command. As more officers arrived, there should have been an increasingly clear understanding of the situation. Instead, the later investigation found that there was confusion about who was in charge and what the officers were expected to do. Multiple law enforcement personnel were present, but the presence of more people did not automatically create a unified command structure. The response lacked a common operational picture. Some officers did not know whether Ramos was still alive. Some believed he might already have been killed. Others believed officers might already be inside the room with him. These beliefs were critically important because the decisions made by officers depended upon what they thought was happening. If an officer believed that the gunman had already been eliminated, the perceived need for immediate action would be radically different. If an officer believed that another team was already inside, the situation would appear different again. But according to the later federal review, Ramos was still inside, and the threat remained active. The uncertainty was therefore not harmless. It became part of the reason the response remained stalled. The passage of time added another layer to the problem. At first, only minutes had passed since Ramos entered the school. Then the minutes became tens of minutes. Officers continued arriving. The number of people available to respond increased. Yet the central question remained unresolved. Who was going to take decisive action? The Department of Justice later identified failures in leadership, incident command, communication, tactics, and training. These failures did not exist separately from one another. They interacted. A lack of clear leadership made command more difficult. A weak command structure made communication less effective. Poor communication created uncertainty about the situation. That uncertainty influenced tactical decisions. And weaknesses in training could make it more difficult for personnel to recognize and respond consistently to an active shooter event. The result was not one isolated mistake, but a chain in which one problem reinforced another. Inside the school, the human reality remained unchanged. Students and teachers were still there. The danger remained. One student eventually called 911, and according to the Federal Review, the call continued for approximately 16 minutes. The student provided information to authorities. That call would become one of the most significant pieces of information in understanding the conditions inside. It meant that there were still people alive. It meant that the situation had not become a simple question of securing an empty classroom. There were survivors who needed help. Yet the response did not immediately move toward an intervention that would end the threat. This is one of the reasons Uvalde became such a powerful example of the consequences of command failure. The problem was not a lack of awareness that something terrible had happened. The problem was that the response did not translate that awareness into timely action. The later Federal Review would not describe the incident as a single officer simply refusing to act. Instead, it documented a broader breakdown involving multiple agencies, unclear leadership, inadequate communication, tactical failures, and training issues. This distinction matters. It would be easy to turn the story into a simple narrative in which one individual could have changed everything. But the evidence supplied for this account does not support such a simplistic conclusion. The failure was institutional and cumulative. The officers who arrived were operating inside a chaotic and dangerous environment. They had already encountered gunfire. They were receiving incomplete information. More officers were arriving from different agencies. But the Federal Review concluded that these circumstances did not adequately explain the prolonged delay. The response needed a clear command structure capable of recognizing the situation for what it was and directing officers accordingly. Instead, the incident remained suspended between two interpretations: an active shooter who still posed an immediate danger, and a barricaded subject who could be contained while officers waited. That ambiguity became devastating. At approximately 12:21 p.m., nearly 50 minutes after the first officers arrived, 4 more shots were fired from inside. Those shots were an unmistakable indication that Ramos was still capable of using his weapon. Whatever uncertainty had existed about whether the attacker was alive should have been challenged by the sound of those shots. The threat had not disappeared. The people inside had not been rescued. The situation remained active. Yet even after that point, the final entry did not occur immediately. More officers were present, but the command and tactical problems remained. The clock continued moving toward the 75-minute mark. Eventually, law enforcement would enter room 111. But that would happen approximately 75 minutes after the first officers arrived, and roughly 77 minutes after the initial response began. The final confrontation would be brief. Officers entered the room. Ramos fired toward them. They returned fire. Ramos was killed. The immediate threat was finally over. But the fact that the final confrontation happened so quickly only made the preceding delay more difficult to understand. The end of the attack demonstrated that the threat could ultimately be stopped. What remained was the question of why it had taken so long to reach that point. The Department of Justice would later describe the response as a failure. Its conclusions focused on leadership, incident command, communication, tactics, training, and delayed action. The report made clear that the problem was not simply that officers lacked courage or that resources were unavailable. The problem was that the response did not function as a coordinated system during an active emergency. The officers had arrived. The threat was known. People were alive inside. Information was coming through 911. Additional officers continued to gather. Yet the response did not produce the immediate intervention that the circumstances required. That is what makes the Uvalde timeline so difficult to separate from the concept of time. The 77 minutes were not one continuous moment of inactivity. They were made up of decisions, assumptions, communications, arrivals, uncertainty, and hesitation. Each element contributed to what eventually became the longest and most consequential period of the incident. And while the officers outside were trying to determine what was happening, the people inside were living through the consequences of that uncertainty. The next part of the story moves closer to those voices. Because among all the evidence collected afterward, one of the most haunting facts was that someone inside the classroom reached out for help. A student called 911. The call lasted approximately 16 minutes. During those 16 minutes, information came from inside the very rooms where Ramos remained. The outside world knew that at least some people were still alive. The question was no longer simply whether the attacker could be located. He had been located. The question was whether the people trapped with him would be reached in time. By the time the response at Robb Elementary had stretched beyond the first few minutes, the people inside rooms 111 and 112 had become separated from the people outside by more than a physical barrier. There was a door, a wall, and an armed attacker between them, but there was also a growing gap between what was happening inside and what those outside understood about the situation. The officers knew that a gunman had entered the school. They knew where the gunfire had come from. They had already moved toward the classrooms and had been met by gunfire. But after retreating to positions of cover, the response increasingly began to resemble a barricaded subject situation rather than an active shooter emergency. Inside the classrooms, however, nothing about the situation had become safe. Salvador Ramos remained there. Students and teachers remained there. The danger continued. And then, during that long period of uncertainty, one of the students inside made a decision that would become one of the most important pieces of information in the later reconstruction of the tragedy. The student called 911. The call lasted approximately 16 minutes. The fact that such a call existed is central to understanding Uvalde because it provided a direct connection between the people trapped inside the classrooms and the authorities outside. This was not information discovered months later through an investigation. It was information emerging while the crisis itself was still unfolding. Someone inside the classroom was able to reach the outside world. The student provided information to authorities. The precise details of the conversation are not contained in the material available for this account, and therefore they cannot responsibly be reconstructed as dialogue. What can be established is that the call lasted approximately 16 minutes and that information was communicated to authorities. That alone carries enormous significance. It meant that the situation inside the classroom was not completely unknown. It meant that there were survivors. It meant that the emergency was still active. And it meant that the passage of time could not simply be interpreted as evidence that the threat had ended. The longer the response continued without reaching the classroom, the more difficult it became to reconcile the reality inside with the interpretation developing outside. An active shooter situation is defined by the continuing presence of an immediate threat. At Robb Elementary, Ramos had entered the school and fired on students and teachers. Officers had responded. They had encountered him. They had then withdrawn. From that point forward, the critical question was whether the threat had actually been eliminated or merely contained. The later Department of Justice review concluded that the response failed to maintain the active shooter mindset that the circumstances required. The 911 call provided another indication that people were still alive and that the danger had not simply become a closed incident. But the existence of information does not automatically mean that information becomes effective. Action. That was one of the deeper problems exposed by Uvalde. The emergency response involved more than simply knowing that something was wrong. It required officers and commanders to build a shared understanding of what was happening and then act upon it. According to the later federal review, that shared understanding was missing. Questions about command and communication remained unresolved. Some officers believed Ramos had already been killed. Others believed that officers might already be inside the room with him. These beliefs reveal how fragmented the operational picture had become. While one person inside was communicating with 911, some officers outside were operating under assumptions that did not accurately reflect the situation. The contrast is stark. Inside, there was evidence that people were still alive. Outside, some officers did not possess a clear understanding of whether the attacker was still alive or whether the room had already been entered. Between those two realities was a failure of communication and command. The student calling 911 therefore becomes more than a detail in the timeline. The call represents a connection between the people trapped inside and the institutions responsible for responding to them. It also illustrates why the later investigation had to look beyond the actions of a single individual. The question was not merely what Ramos had done. Investigators needed to determine what officers knew, when they knew it, how that information was communicated, and how it influenced their decisions. The Department of Justice would eventually examine more than 14,000 pieces of data and documents, including security camera footage, body camera footage, audio recordings, photographs, training records, agency policies, investigative records, witness statements, communications data, and medical and emergency response documentation. The 911 call formed part of that broader body of evidence. Together, these materials allowed investigators to reconstruct the incident in greater detail and compare what actually happened with the explanations given during and after the attack. But during the attack itself, there was no completed timeline. There was only the unfolding present. The student inside could not know what investigators would later discover. The officers outside could not know what a federal review would conclude nearly 2 years later. Families outside the school could not know how much longer they would have to wait before learning what had happened to their children or loved ones. The uncertainty was therefore experienced differently by everyone involved. For those inside, it was immediate. For those outside, it became a question of information. For families, it became a question of whether the people they loved were alive. And for investigators later, it became a question of accountability. The passage of approximately 16 minutes on a 911 call also has a larger significance because it reminds us that the tragedy was not frozen at the moment Ramos entered the school. The attack continued to evolve. The initial gunfire had already occurred. Officers had already arrived. They had already approached the classrooms. They had already been fired upon. Yet the situation had not ended. The student was still able to call for help. That meant the window of time during which intervention might occur was still open. It would eventually close with catastrophic consequences. Nearly 50 minutes after the first officers arrived, at approximately 12:21 p.m., more shots were fired from inside the classroom. Those shots would provide another unmistakable indication that the threat remained active. They were evidence that Ramos was still alive and still capable of using his weapon. The fact that those shots came after the lengthy period of uncertainty made them especially significant. Whatever assumptions had developed about the possibility that Ramos had already been killed could no longer be easily reconciled with what was happening. Yet even then, the final entry would not occur immediately. More officers had arrived. More resources were available. But the central problems of command and tactical understanding remained. This is where the story of the student who called 911 connects directly to the broader failure. Identified by the Department of Justice, the call represented information from inside. The later gunfire represented evidence that the threat remained active. The increasing number of officers represented growing resources outside. Yet these elements did not immediately combine into a unified response. The problem was therefore not simply a lack of information. It was the inability to turn information into a coordinated and timely decision. That distinction is essential. In retrospect, it can be tempting to look at the timeline and imagine that every piece of information should have made the next decision obvious. But emergencies do not unfold with the clarity of hindsight. Officers were operating with incomplete information under dangerous conditions, and after having already been fired upon. At the same time, the Federal Review found that the response suffered from failures in leadership, incident command, communication, tactics, and training. Those findings suggest that the problem was not simply the difficulty of the moment. It was also the absence of an effective system for responding to that difficulty. The student's call therefore stands as one of the most important human elements in the Uvalde timeline. It reminds us that behind the statistics and official terminology were actual people trying to communicate through an unfolding catastrophe. There were no cameras inside the minds of the children and teachers. There was no way to narrate their thoughts without inventing them. But there was a call. A connection was made. Information was transmitted. Someone inside was telling the outside world that help was needed. And still, the response continued. The story of Uvalde would eventually become a story about evidence, reports, and institutional accountability, but beneath those words was something much simpler. People were alive inside the classroom, and time was passing. 16 minutes of a 911 call was not simply a duration recorded in a report. It was 16 minutes during which a survivor remained connected to authorities while the emergency continued. It was 16 minutes in which the outside world had a direct line to someone inside. And it was part of a larger period that would eventually reach approximately 77 minutes before Ramos was confronted and killed. The next major point in that timeline would come at 12:21 p.m., when 4 shots were fired from inside. Those shots would make one fact impossible to ignore. The attacker was still there. The danger was still active, and the clock was still moving. At approximately 12:21 p.m., nearly 50 minutes after the first officers arrived at Robb Elementary School, 4 shots were fired from inside the classroom where Salvador Ramos remained. By this point, the incident had already lasted far longer than the first moments of confusion that followed the initial gunfire. Officers had arrived. Some had moved toward rooms 111 and 112. They had encountered Ramos and been fired upon. 2 officers had been injured by fragments. The officers had moved back toward positions of cover. More law enforcement personnel had arrived. A student inside had called 911 and remained connected to authorities for approximately 16 Minutes. Yet Ramos had not been confronted, and the people inside had not been rescued. Then came the 4 shots at 12:21. In the timeline of Uvalde, those 4 shots matter because they provided direct evidence that the threat remained active. Ramos was still alive. He was still capable of firing his weapon. And the emergency inside the classroom had not become a situation in which officers could simply assume that the danger had passed. The sound of those shots should be understood within the larger context of the response. The central problem identified later by the Department of Justice was not that officers had failed to recognize that something terrible had happened. They knew a shooting had occurred. They knew where the gunfire had originated. They had already approached the classrooms. The problem was that the response increasingly treated Ramos as a barricaded subject rather than maintaining the understanding that he was an active shooter. That distinction had consequences. If a suspect is believed to be contained, officers may operate under the assumption that there is time to establish command, coordinate resources, gather information, and plan their next action. But if an active shooter remains inside with students and teachers, the threat is continuing. The Federal Review later concluded that the active shooter mindset should have been maintained. The 4 shots at 12:21 were a stark reminder of why. They demonstrated that the attacker had not been neutralized. The people inside were still in danger, and the clock was still moving. By this point, the number of officers at the scene had grown. The response was no longer a matter of waiting for law enforcement to arrive. Law enforcement was already there, and more personnel were continuing to arrive. That created another question that would become central to the later investigation. Why did the growing number of officers not produce a clear and immediate response? The answer, according to the Department of Justice review, involved a combination of failures rather than one isolated mistake. Leadership was a problem. Incident command was a problem. Communication was a problem. Tactical decision-making was a problem. Training was a problem. The failures were connected, and together they created a situation in which officers did not share a clear understanding of what was happening or what should happen next. In an emergency, information is valuable only if it reaches the people who need it and is translated into action. At Uvalde, the information available to officers was not consistently transformed into a unified operational picture. Some officers believed Ramos might already have been killed. Others believed officers might already be inside the room with him. These beliefs were inconsistent with the reality that later evidence would establish. Ramos remained inside. He remained capable of shooting. The 4 shots at 12:21 reinforced that reality. Yet the command structure remained unclear. Who was responsible for making the decision to enter? Who had the authority to direct the response? What did different officers believe had already happened? What information was being communicated between the agencies and officers present? These questions became part of the later federal review because the tragedy could not be understood simply by looking at the final moments. The final confrontation was relatively brief. The delay that preceded it was not. That contrast is important. When law enforcement finally entered room 111, Ramos fired toward the officers, and they returned fire. Ramos was killed. The immediate threat ended. But before that final confrontation, approximately 75 minutes had passed since the first officers arrived. The total period from the arrival of those first officers to the final confrontation was approximately 77 minutes. The significance of the 12:21 shots therefore lies in what they revealed about the remaining time. At 12:21, the situation was still active. The final intervention had not yet happened. There were still people inside. The attacker was still alive. The threat had not been resolved. Yet the response would continue for a period of time after those shots before officers finally entered. This is one of the reasons the Uvalde case became a national symbol of law enforcement response. Failure. The issue was not simply that an attacker had entered a school and created an impossible situation. The issue was that the emergency continued while officers were already present and while additional personnel and resources were accumulating outside. The later federal investigation would examine the entire chain rather than isolating one moment. Investigators would spend 54 days in Uvalde and interview more than 260 people. They would review more than 14,000 pieces of data and documents, including security camera footage, body camera footage, audio recordings, photographs, training records, agency policies, investigative records, witness statements, communications data, and medical and emergency response documentation. The purpose was to establish what happened and how the response developed. That reconstruction would show that the problem was not simply a failure to possess enough officers. The problem was how those officers were organized, informed, and directed. The 1221 shots also connect directly to the earlier 911 call. A student had already communicated with authorities from inside the classroom. That call lasted approximately 16 minutes. The call demonstrated that there were survivors inside and that information was reaching the outside world. The later shots demonstrated that the attacker remained capable of firing. Taken together, these facts made the nature of the emergency increasingly difficult to dismiss. There were people alive inside. There was an armed attacker inside. The attacker had demonstrated that he was still capable of using his weapon. Yet the final entry had still not occurred. The passage of time became one of the most important elements of the tragedy. At first, the delay could be measured in minutes. Then it approached half an hour. Then nearly 50 minutes. At 12:21, the 4 shots marked another point on that timeline. They were not simply another detail in a long sequence of gunfire. They represented confirmation that the threat remained active while the response continued outside. The Federal Review later described the law enforcement response as a failure. It identified serious shortcomings in leadership, incident command, communication, tactics, and training. Those conclusions are important because they move the discussion beyond the question of individual hesitation. Uvalde was not simply about one person deciding to wait. It was about a response system that failed to produce clear and decisive action during an active emergency. The absence of unified command meant that officers did not necessarily share the same understanding of the situation. Communication failures contributed to uncertainty. Tactical errors followed from that uncertainty. Training and policy failures influenced how the situation was interpreted. And the result was a prolonged delay while the attacker remained inside with children and teachers. Yet even with all of these findings, there remains a limit to what can responsibly be said about the outcome. It is impossible from the supplied information to state with certainty exactly how many additional lives might have been saved had officers entered earlier. The Federal Review identified the response as a failure, but it did not provide a simple numerical answer to the question of how many victims could definitely have survived under a different timeline. That uncertainty should not be replaced with speculation. What can be said is that earlier intervention was the purpose of the active shooter response model, and that the failure to maintain that mindset prolonged the period during which Ramos remained with the victims. At 12:21, the evidence of an active threat was unmistakable. For shots came from inside. The attacker was alive. The threat remained. The people inside still needed help. And yet the final confrontation was still ahead. The next stage of the story would bring the 77-minute timeline toward its conclusion. Approximately 75 minutes after the first officers arrived, law enforcement would finally enter room 111. The confrontation would be brief. Ramos would fire toward the officers. They would return fire. Ramos would be killed. But before that happened, the minutes continued to accumulate. The difference between 12:21 and the final entry would become part of the larger question that Uvalde left behind. When the evidence shows that the threat is still active, when people are still alive inside, and when law enforcement is already at the scene, how does a response become trapped in uncertainty for so long? The answer would emerge slowly through the investigation that followed. But on that afternoon, there was no report yet, no federal review, and no completed explanation. There was only the classroom, the officers outside, the people inside, and the continuing passage of time. The most difficult part of the Uvalde timeline is not simply that Salvador Ramos entered Robb Elementary and began shooting. It is what happened after law enforcement officers arrived. The first officers were not hours away. They were there within minutes. 5 officers moved toward rooms 111 and 112 after hearing gunfire. Ramos fired from inside. 2 officers were injured by fragments, and the officers moved back toward cover. From that point, the response entered a period of uncertainty that would last for most of an hour. The incident increasingly came to be treated as a barricaded subject situation rather than an active shooter emergency. More officers arrived. Questions about command and communication became increasingly important. Inside the classroom, students and teachers remained trapped. One student called 911 and stayed connected for approximately 16 minutes. And at approximately 12:21 p.m., nearly 50 minutes after the first officers arrived, 4 more shots came from inside. Ramos was still alive. The threat was still active. Yet the final entry had not happened. The clock continued forward. Approximately 75 minutes after the first officers arrived, law enforcement finally entered room 111. By then, the response had become one of the most consequential failures examined in the aftermath of the shooting. The final confrontation itself did not take 75 minutes. Once officers entered the room, Ramos fired toward them, and the officers returned fire. Ramos was killed. The immediate threat ended. But the length of time before that final confrontation became the central fact that investigators, families, officials, and the public would have to confront. Approximately 77 minutes had passed from the arrival of the first officers until Ramos was confronted and killed. To understand those 77 minutes, it is important not to imagine them as 77 minutes in which nothing happened. The period was filled with movement, communication, uncertainty, arrivals, decisions, and changing perceptions. Officers were coming into the school. Different agencies were involved. Information was being gathered. People were attempting to understand what was happening inside. But the problem was that these actions did not produce a unified response. The later Department of Justice review identified failures in leadership, incident command, communication, tactics, training, and delayed action. Those failures were connected. Without clear leadership, command became uncertain. Without effective command, information did not necessarily produce a common understanding. Without a common understanding, tactical decisions became more difficult. And without the correct tactical understanding of an active shooter, the urgency of reaching the threat could diminish. That chain helps explain why the 77 minutes became so important. The response did not simply stop. It became trapped in an interpretation of the situation that was inconsistent with what was happening inside. The gunman remained in the classroom. The victims remained there. The threat remained capable of producing additional violence. Yet the response increasingly treated the situation as one in which there was time to wait. The student's 911 call was an especially important part of this contradiction. Someone inside was communicating with authorities. The call lasted approximately 16 minutes. The student provided information to law enforcement. This meant that authorities had a direct indication that people were still alive inside the affected area. The existence of survivors meant the incident was not simply a matter of securing a location after the attacker had disappeared. There was still an urgent human situation behind the classroom doors. Yet the response continued. Then came the 4 shots at approximately 12:21 p.m. Those shots should be understood as a point on the timeline that confirmed the threat had not ended. Ramos was still alive. He still possessed the ability to fire. The people inside were still exposed to danger, and officers were still outside the classroom. More personnel had arrived by then, but the central problem remained. There was no sufficiently clear and unified understanding of what should happen next. According to the later review, some officers believed Ramos had already been killed or that officers were already inside the room with him. Such beliefs reveal how deeply the communication and command problems had affected the response. Officers could be standing in the same building while possessing very different understandings of the situation. One might believe the threat had already been eliminated. Another might believe that another team had already entered. Meanwhile, the actual threat remained inside the classroom. The result was a dangerous gap between perception and reality. The investigation that followed would attempt to reconstruct that gap. The Department of Justice did not rely on one account. Investigators reviewed more than 14,000 pieces of data and documents, including security camera footage, body camera footage, audio recordings, photographs, training records, agency policies, investigative records, witness statements, communications data, and medical and emergency response documentation. They spent 54 days in Uvalde and interviewed more than 260 people. This enormous collection of evidence was necessary because the events inside the school could not be understood through a single narrative. The timeline had to be rebuilt from multiple sources. The federal review would eventually conclude that the response represented a failure. But that conclusion did not erase the complexity of the situation faced by officers at the scene. They were operating in a dangerous environment. They had already encountered gunfire. 2 officers had been injured by fragments. They were receiving incomplete information. Multiple agencies and personnel were involved. Yet the federal assessment determined that the response nevertheless suffered from serious failures in leadership, command, communication, tactics, and training. Those failures contributed to the delay, and the delay had consequences. The question of what might have happened if officers had entered earlier remains impossible to answer with certainty from the information provided. It would be irresponsible to assign a precise number of lives that could have been saved. The federal findings establish that the response was deeply flawed, but they do not provide a simple alternative timeline in which the outcome can be known with certainty. What can be stated clearly is that the purpose of an active shooter response is to reach the threat and stop it so that victims can be rescued. At Uvalde, that process did not occur quickly enough. Approximately 75 minutes after the first officers arrived, the decision was finally made to enter room 111. The circumstances inside had not fundamentally changed in the sense that Ramos was still the attacker, and the people inside still needed protection. What changed was the decision to act. Officers entered the room. Ramos fired toward them. They returned fire. Ramos was killed. The immediate threat was over. The 77-minute period had ended. But the questions created during those minutes had only begun. Why had officers not maintained the active shooter mindset? Why was command unclear? Why did some officers believe Ramos might already be dead? Why did some believe officers were already inside? Why did information from inside fail to produce a coordinated rescue? These questions would become the foundation of the investigation that followed. The aftermath would also raise another difficult issue. The public had initially been given information about the response that later proved incomplete, inaccurate, or contradictory. As video footage, recordings, 911 calls, and other evidence were examined, the understanding of what happened changed. The official narrative that emerged immediately after the attack could no longer be treated as the complete account. The investigation, therefore, became not only an examination of tactical decisions, but also an effort to establish what had actually happened during those 77 minutes. At the end of the incident, 21 people were dead, 19 children and 2 teachers. Other people had been injured, including students, teachers, and law enforcement officers. The families waiting outside had endured an extraordinary period of uncertainty. The survivors would have to live with the consequences. For the community of Uvalde, the end of the shooting did not mean the end of the story. The classroom was eventually secured, but the questions remained. The officers had arrived. They had heard the gunfire. They had moved toward the classrooms. They had retreated. More officers had arrived. A student had called 911. 4 additional shots had been fired. And then, after approximately 75 minutes, officers entered. The final confrontation lasted only a short time before Ramos was killed. That contrast became one of the defining features of the case. The most consequential period was not the final exchange of gunfire. It was the long interval before it. 77 minutes became a measure of institutional failure. But it was also a measure of human vulnerability. During those minutes, the people inside remained more than names in a later report. They were children and teachers who were still alive, still trapped, and still waiting for the threat to end. The eventual federal review would attempt to explain how a response could fail in such circumstances. It would examine leadership, command, communications tactics, training, and the decisions made as the emergency unfolded. But before those findings could be written, the families of the victims had to confront a much simpler and more devastating reality. The people they loved were not coming home. The gunfire had ended, but the consequences had only begun. When the gunfire at Robb Elementary finally ended, the most important fact was not that Salvador Ramos had been killed. It was that 21 people had died. 19 of them were children. 2 were teachers. The number would become one of the most frequently repeated facts about the Uvalde shooting, but a number can never fully express what was lost. 21 is precise enough for a report, a headline, or a statistical record. It is not large enough to contain 21 lives, 21 families, 21 sets of relationships, or the absence that would remain after May 24, 2022. The tragedy, therefore, cannot be understood only through the actions of the gunman or through the 77-minute response. At its center were the people inside Robb Elementary who never left the school alive. On the morning of the attack, those 19 children and 2 teachers had been part of an ordinary school community. They had entered the building as students and educators, not as participants in a national tragedy. Their day began in the familiar environment of classrooms, lessons, teachers, and classmates. Then, at approximately 11:33 a.m., Ramos entered the school and began firing into rooms 111 and 112. The ordinary structure of the school day disappeared almost instantly. The people inside were placed in an emergency they had not chosen and could not control. The fact that the victims were children makes the setting especially difficult to comprehend. An elementary school is fundamentally a place built around protection and education. The people inside depend upon adults to create an environment where they can learn safely. On that day, that expectation was destroyed. Teachers were not simply educators in a classroom anymore. Students were not simply children attending school. They became people trapped in an unfolding attack. Yet even that description risks turning them into anonymous figures. The number 19 can obscure the individuality of each child. The number 2 can make the teachers seem like statistics rather than people who had lives beyond that classroom. The supplied information does not provide detailed biographies for each victim, and therefore those details cannot responsibly be invented. But there is still something important that can be said without speculation. Every person represented by that number had a life that existed before May 24, 2022. And every family represented by those deaths had to confront an absence that would continue after the cameras left Uvalde and the official reports were completed. The aftermath also included people who survived. Students, teachers, and law enforcement officers were injured. Survival, however, did not mean that the incident ended for them when Ramos was killed. The consequences of an event like Uvalde extend beyond the moment when the immediate threat disappears. Survivors are left with the memory of what happened, and families are left with the consequences of losing someone they love. The information provided for this account does not establish individual psychological diagnoses or specific private experiences, so those details should not be invented. But the broader reality is clear. The shooting produced consequences that continued long after the gunfire stopped. Families outside the school experienced another kind of uncertainty while the incident was unfolding. They needed to know whether their children and loved ones were safe. The passage of time therefore carried meaning beyond the tactical response. Every minute without clear information could deepen fear. The school remained the center of an emergency, while people outside waited for answers. Eventually, those answers would come, but for the families of the 21 victims, the answer was devastating. Their loved ones would not return home. This is one of the reasons the story of Uvalde should not be reduced to the identity of Salvador. Ramos was responsible for the attack and for the deaths he caused. But concentrating the narrative entirely on him risks giving the perpetrator more space than the people he killed. The victim should remain at the center of the story. Their deaths are not merely the outcome of a criminal act. They are the reason the response was examined so intensely afterward. They are the reason the 77-minute timeline matters. And they are the reason the questions surrounding leadership, command, communication, tactics, and training became matters of public accountability. The Department of Justice review emphasized this broader human context. Its purpose was not simply to reconstruct the movements of officers or determine the sequence of decisions. The review sought to provide an independent account of what happened, recognize the victims and survivors, and identify lessons that could help prevent similar failures in the future. That mission is important because investigations can sometimes become consumed by systems, procedures, and statistics. Reports discuss command structures. They describe communication failures. They examine policies and training. They measure minutes and identify decisions. All of those things are necessary, but behind every technical finding is a human consequence. When the report identifies a delayed response, it is describing time that passed while people remained in danger. When it identifies a failure of communication, it is describing information that did not become effective action. When it identifies a failure of leadership, it is describing the absence of the coordination needed during a crisis. And when it records 21 deaths, it is recording the permanent result of the tragedy. The 21 victims also provide the clearest reason to avoid sensationalizing the attacker. There is a temptation in true crime storytelling to focus heavily on the perpetrator because his actions create the mystery and the narrative tension. But Uvalde does not require a mythology around Ramos. There is no need to make him larger than the people he harmed. His background can be examined factually. His actions can be reconstructed accurately. His responsibility can be stated clearly, but the emotional center of the story belongs elsewhere. It belongs with the children and teachers who were inside the school. It belongs with the survivors. It belongs with the families waiting outside. And it belongs with the community left to process what had happened. The number 21 also changed the meaning of the word aftermath. After a conventional emergency, the end of the immediate threat can provide a clear dividing line between danger and safety. At Uvalde, the gunfire ended, but the questions multiplied. Why had the response taken so long? Why had the incident been increasingly treated as a barricaded subject situation? Why was command unclear? Why did some officers believe the attacker might already be dead? Why did information from inside fail to produce a rapid rescue? And what could be learned from the tragedy? These questions became inseparable from the memory of the victims. The Federal Review eventually examined more than 14,000 pieces of data and documents and interviewed more than 260 people. Investigators spent 54 days in Uvalde reconstructing the events. The resulting report, released on January 18, 2024, described the law enforcement response as a failure and identified serious problems involving leadership, incident command, communication, tactics, training, and delayed action. The report did not erase the suffering of the families. No report could, but it attempted to establish an accurate record of what had happened and to identify lessons that might prevent a similar failure. That effort matters because memory can become distorted over time. Initial accounts can be incomplete. Public statements can conflict with evidence. The details of an emergency can become confused as different people remember the same event differently. A careful investigation attempts to separate what is known from what is assumed. In Uvalde, that process was especially important because the consequences were so permanent. 21 people were dead. There was no opportunity to undo what had happened. There was only the responsibility to understand it. The story of the victims also changes the way the 77 minutes should be remembered. 77 minutes can sound like an abstract figure until it is connected to the people who were inside. During that period, children and teachers remained in danger. One student called 911. Officers remained outside, while the command structure remained uncertain. At 12:21 p.m., shots were fired from inside. Eventually, officers entered and Ramos was killed. But the victims who died were not simply waiting for the final moment. They were living through the crisis minute by minute. The precise experiences of individuals cannot be invented, and their private thoughts should not be turned into fictional dialogue. What can be stated is enough. They were there, the threat was inside, help had not yet reached them, and the consequences were irreversible. In the end, the most important number in Uvalde is not 77. It is 21. 77 describes the length of the law enforcement response before the final confrontation. 21 describes the human cost. 19 children and 2 teachers died. Others survived and were injured. Families were changed forever. A community was forced to confront not only the violence of an individual, but also the failures of institutions responding to that violence. The tragedy, therefore, demands 2 kinds of remembrance. The first is remembrance of the people who died, so that their lives are not reduced to a casualty figure. The second is remembrance of what went wrong, so that the failures identified afterward are not forgotten. Uvalde became a national tragedy because of the violence Ramos brought into the school. But it became an enduring lesson in institutional responsibility because the response that followed failed to end that violence quickly enough. The names of the victims belong at the heart of that lesson. Their lives were more than the final statistics of a school shooting. They were the reason the questions mattered in the first place. And long after the last officer left Robb Elementary, long after the federal review was completed, and long after the public conversation moved on to other stories, the families of those 21 people were left with something that no investigation could reverse: the knowledge that on May 24th, 2022, their loved ones went to school, and they never came home. What happened in the 77 minutes? The gunfire at Robb Elementary ended when law enforcement finally entered room 111 and confronted Salvador Ramos. Ramos fired toward the officers returned fire, and Ramos was killed. The immediate threat was over, but the questions created by the 77-minute response were only beginning. In the hours and days after May 24th, 2022, the public needed to understand not only what Ramos had done, but also what had happened while officers were already inside the school. The central question became painfully simple. How had a gunman remained inside an elementary school for so long after law enforcement had arrived? The answer could not be found in a single statement or a single piece of evidence. It required reconstructing the entire response, minute by minute, and determining what officers knew, what they believed, who was directing them, and why the final intervention took approximately 75 minutes after the first officers arrived. The investigation that followed, therefore, became almost as important as the attack itself. It was an attempt to separate what was known from what had initially been reported, and what had actually happened from what people believed had happened at the time. The Department of Justice eventually conducted an independent critical incident review. The scale of that review reflected the complexity of the case. Investigators examined more than 14,000 pieces of data and documents. Those materials included security camera footage, body camera recordings, audio recordings, photographs, training records, agency policies, investigative records, witness statements, communications data, and medical and emergency response documentation. Investigators also spent 54 days in Uvalde and interviewed more than 260 people. This was not an investigation based on one witness remembering one event. It was an attempt to reconstruct an entire emergency response from multiple sources. The purpose was equally important. The review was intended to establish an independent account of what happened, recognize the victims and survivors, and identify lessons that could help prevent a similar tragedy in the future. That objective mattered because the initial understanding of the police response had already become controversial. Some of the early public statements created the impression that law enforcement had reacted quickly and effectively. Later, as video footage, 911 calls, recordings, and other evidence became available, that impression was challenged. The picture that emerged was substantially different. The Department of Justice later criticized the information provided during and after the attack as inaccurate, incomplete, and contradictory. That finding introduced another layer of tragedy into the aftermath. The community was not only trying to understand why 21 people had died, it was also trying to understand whether the public had been given an accurate account of what happened while the emergency was unfolding. The difference between the initial narrative and the later evidence became significant because the families of the victims deserved clarity. They were already confronting the worst possible loss. They also deserved to know what had happened inside the school and why the response had taken so long. The investigation, therefore, had to look beyond the actions of Ramos. His responsibility for the shooting was direct. He entered the school armed, opened fire, and killed 19 children and 2 teachers. But the federal review was examining a different question. How did the institutions responsible for responding to the attack perform once the gunman was inside? The findings were severe. The Department of Justice concluded that the law enforcement response was a failure. The review identified problems involving leadership, incident command, coordination, communication, tactics, and training. These were not presented as unrelated technical defects. They formed a chain. The absence of clear leadership contributed to problems with command. The lack of a unified command structure contributed to communication failures. Communication failures contributed to an incomplete understanding of what was happening inside the classrooms. That uncertainty influenced tactical decisions, and the overall response failed to maintain the active shooter mindset required by the circumstances. The distinction between an active shooter and a barricaded subject became one of the most important findings. After the first officers moved toward rooms 111 and 112 and encountered gunfire, they withdrew to positions of cover. From that point, the situation increasingly came to be handled as though Ramos were barricaded inside the classroom. But the reality was different. He had already demonstrated that he was willing to shoot people. Students and teachers were still inside. A student called 911 and remained on the line for approximately 16 minutes. And at approximately 12:21 p.m., more shots were fired from inside. Those facts showed that the threat had not ended. Ramos was still alive and still capable of firing. Yet the response did not immediately transition back to the active shooter model that would prioritize reaching and stopping him. This failure became central to the federal assessment because the classification of the situation affected the urgency of the response. A barricaded subject may be contained while officers establish command and prepare a coordinated intervention. An active shooter requires a fundamentally different sense of urgency because victims may remain in immediate danger. At Uvalde, the people inside the classroom were not protected by the passage of time. The attacker was still there. The longer the response continued without reaching him, the longer the victims remained exposed. Another major issue was the lack of a clear understanding among officers about what was actually happening. Some officers believed Ramos had already been killed or that officers were already inside the classroom with him. Such beliefs were inconsistent with reality. Ramos remained inside until officers eventually entered and killed him. This demonstrated the consequences of fragmented communication. An emergency response can involve many people, but if those people do not share the same understanding of the situation, the number of personnel does not necessarily produce effective action. At Uvalde, more officers continued to arrive, yet the central uncertainty remained. Who was in command? What was the current status of the gunmen? Were there survivors inside? Why had the classroom not been entered? The Federal Review found that these questions were part of a broader failure in incident command. The investigation also had to confront the difference between what officials believed at the time and what the evidence later established. In a rapidly developing emergency, information can be incomplete. Officers may make decisions under pressure and with limited knowledge. But the responsibility of a later investigation is different. Investigators can compare accounts against recordings, documents, photographs, communications, and other evidence. That is why the enormous volume of material collected by the Department of Justice was necessary. The goal was to reconstruct the timeline rather than rely solely on memory. The review ultimately provided a detailed institutional assessment of the response. It did not erase the complexity of the circumstances officers faced, including the fact that the first officers encountered gunfire and that 2 were injured by fragments. But it concluded that the response nevertheless represented a serious failure. The finding was not limited to one tactical decision. It concerned the broader system that was supposed to transform a rapidly unfolding emergency into a coordinated response. The Federal Review was released on January 18, 2024. By then, the shooting had already become one of the most closely examined school attacks in the United States. Nearly 2 years had passed since May 24, 2022. During that time, the families of the victims had continued living with their losses. Survivors had continued living with the consequences of the attack. And the public had continued asking how the response could have unfolded as it did. The report offered an answer, but not a simple one. It described a combination of failures rather than a single cause. Leadership had failed. Command had failed. Coordination had failed. Communication had failed. Tactical decisions had failed. Training had been insufficient. And the response had not maintained the appropriate active shooter mindset. These findings transformed the meaning of the 77-minute timeline. The number was no longer simply a measurement of how long it took officers to reach Ramos. It became evidence of a system that had failed to respond effectively to an active threat. Yet the investigation also established an important limit on what could be concluded. It is impossible to state with certainty exactly how many victims might have survived if officers had entered earlier. The evidence demonstrates that the response was seriously flawed, but it does not permit a responsible reconstruction of an alternative timeline in which a precise number of lives can be guaranteed to have been saved. That distinction matters. The suffering of the victim should not be used to create certainty where the evidence cannot provide it. What can be established is that the response prolonged the period during which Ramos remained inside, with students and teachers. That is the core finding. The investigation, therefore, moved the story beyond the question of why Ramos committed the attack. It placed responsibility for examining the institutional response alongside the criminal responsibility of the attacker. The 2 questions are different, but both are necessary to understand Uvalde. Ramos caused the shooting. The response to that shooting then became a separate tragedy of its own. The Department of Justice review sought to explain how that second tragedy developed. And as the findings became public, another question remained. What should happen after an official investigation identifies such serious failures? A report can reconstruct the past. It can identify errors. It can recommend lessons. But accountability requires more than describing what went wrong. It requires confronting the consequences and determining what must change. For Uvalde, that process would remain tied to the 21 people who died. The investigation could not bring them back. It could not undo the 77 minutes. But it could establish a record of what happened and ensure that the tragedy was not reduced to an unexplained statistic. The story had moved from the classroom to the investigation room, from gunfire to evidence, from immediate survival to questions of institutional responsibility. And at the center of that investigation remained the same fact that had defined the tragedy from the beginning: When the first officers arrived, the emergency was still active. The attacker was still inside. People were still alive, and the response did not end the threat for approximately 77 minutes. The story of Robb Elementary did not end when Salvador Ramos was killed. In some ways, that moment marked the beginning of another chapter, one concerned not with stopping the immediate threat, but with understanding what had happened and why the response had failed. The gunfire had stopped. The school had been secured. 21 people were dead. 19 children and 2 teachers would never return to their families. Others had survived, some with physical injuries and many carrying the consequences of an experience that could not simply be left behind when the emergency ended. For Uvalde, the aftermath became a long examination of responsibility. The central question was no longer only, what did Salvador Ramos do? That question had an obvious answer. Ramos was the attacker who entered Robb Elementary, opened fire, and killed 21 people. The harder questions concerned everyone who had responded after he entered the building. What did they know? What did they believe? Who was in command? Why did the response change from an active shooter operation into what was increasingly treated as a barricaded subject situation? Why did officers remain outside while students and teachers were still inside? And why did it take approximately 77 minutes before the threat was finally eliminated? These questions became the foundation of the federal investigation. The Department of Justice conducted an independent critical incident review designed to establish an accurate account of the events, recognize the victims and survivors, and identify lessons that could help prevent similar failures. Investigators spent 54 days in Uvalde and interviewed more than 260 people. They examined more than 14,000 pieces of data and documents, including security camera footage, body camera recordings, audio, photographs, training records, agency policies, investigative files, witness statements, communications data, and medical and emergency response records. The scale of the investigation reflected the complexity of the failure. There was no single document that could explain the 77 minutes. No single witness possessed the entire picture. The truth had to be reconstructed from many sources. When the Department of Justice released its review on January 18, 2024, its conclusion was severe. The law enforcement response at Robb Elementary was a failure. The report identified shortcomings in leadership, incident command, coordination, communication, tactics, and training. Those findings were significant because they demonstrated that the delay was not simply the result of one isolated decision. It was the product of multiple failures occurring within the same emergency. The lack of clear leadership made it difficult to establish a unified command. Poor coordination made it harder for different personnel and agencies to operate from the same understanding. Communication problems allowed confusion about the status of Ramos and the situation inside the classroom to persist. Tactical failures contributed to the delay. Training deficiencies meant that officers and agencies did not respond with the consistency and urgency required for an active shooter situation. The federal assessment therefore transformed the 77-minute timeline into a lesson about institutional responsibility. The most important lesson was that an active shooter cannot be treated as though time is available, simply because the attacker is contained within a room. At Robb Elementary, students and teachers were inside with Ramos. One student called 911 and remained connected for approximately 16 minutes. The student provided information to authorities. At approximately 12:21 p.m., 4 additional shots were fired from inside. These facts demonstrated that the danger was continuing. Yet the response did not immediately return to the active shooter mindset that the circumstances required. That failure had consequences that could never be reversed. The report also highlighted the importance of unified command. An emergency involving multiple law enforcement personnel and agencies requires someone to establish clear authority and a shared operational picture. Officers need to know who is responsible for decisions, what information is confirmed, what the tactical objective is, and what other personnel are doing. At Uvalde, the Federal Review found that these elements were not functioning effectively. Some officers did not know who was in charge. Some believed Ramos might already have been killed. Others believed officers might already be inside the classroom. Such confusion illustrates why command is not merely an administrative issue. During an active emergency, command can determine whether information becomes action or whether information remains fragmented among individuals. The report also raised the importance of communication. In the modern emergency response environment, information can come from many sources: officers, dispatchers, 911 callers, cameras, witnesses, and other agencies. But information only becomes useful when it is accurately shared and understood. At Uvalde, the later investigation found that information presented during and after the incident was inaccurate, incomplete, and contradictory. That problem affected not only the operational response, but also public trust afterward. Families and community members had to confront a tragedy while trying to understand whether the official account reflected what had actually happened. The later evidence forced a reassessment of those early explanations. This became an important part of the legacy of Uvalde because public trust is itself part of emergency response. When a community experiences a catastrophe, people need accurate information. Contradictory accounts can deepen an already profound sense of uncertainty and loss. The lessons from Uvalde therefore extend beyond tactics. They include leadership, communication, transparency, training, and accountability. But perhaps the most important lesson is that the victims must remain at the center of the discussion. It is easy for a long investigation to become a story about policies, procedures, command structures, and institutional failures. Those things matter, but they matter because of the people affected by them. 21 people died. 19 were children. 2 were teachers. Other students, teachers, and officers were injured. Families were changed permanently. Survivors were left with the consequences of what they experienced. The Federal Review's emphasis on recognizing victims and survivors is therefore more than a formal statement. It is a reminder that the purpose of investigating Uvalde is not simply to understand how a police operation failed. It is to understand what happened to human beings and what can be learned so that another community is not forced to experience the same kind of loss. There is also an important lesson in what cannot be known. It is impossible to state with certainty exactly how many lives could have been saved if officers had entered earlier. The federal findings establish that the response was a serious failure, but they do not allow a precise alternative history to be written. It would be wrong to transform uncertainty into speculation. What can be said is that the delay left students and teachers with the active shooter for more than an hour. That fact alone explains why the response became such a powerful subject of scrutiny. Accountability, therefore, begins with acknowledging what is known. Ramos was responsible for the attack. He was the person who entered the school and opened fire. But the failures identified in the law enforcement response belong to the institutions and systems responsible for responding to the emergency. Recognizing both truths does not diminish either one. Instead, it provides a more complete understanding of the tragedy. Uvalde was simultaneously a mass shooting committed by an individual and a catastrophic failure in emergency response. The two realities exist together. The legacy of Uvalde is also inseparable from the question of whether lessons will actually be remembered. Reports can identify failures. Investigations can reconstruct timelines. Recommendations can describe what should change. But none of those things can restore the lives lost on May 24, 2022. The only meaningful response to such an irreversible loss is to treat the findings seriously and ensure that the failures identified do not become forgotten details in an old report. The 77 minutes should therefore be remembered not as a number alone, but as a warning about what can happen when leadership, command, communication, tactics, and training fail at the same time. The first officers arrived within minutes. That fact makes Uvalde different from many other emergencies in which law enforcement must first reach the scene. The officers were there. They knew where the gunfire had come from. They encountered the attacker. Yet the response did not end the threat quickly. That is why Uvalde continues to raise difficult questions about preparedness and responsibility. The purpose of those questions should not be to create spectacle. It should be to understand how institutions behave under pressure and how they can become better, prepared to protect people when seconds matter. Ultimately, however, Uvalde should not be remembered only as a case study in police failure. It should be remembered as the story of 21 people whose lives ended inside an elementary school on May 24, 2022. The investigation, the reports, the debates, and the questions all exist because those lives were lost. The children and teachers who entered Robb Elementary that morning could not know what would happen before the school day ended. Their families could not know that an ordinary morning would become a permanent dividing line in their lives. The survivors could not know how long the consequences would follow them. And the officers who arrived could not know that their decisions would later become the subject of one of the most detailed examinations of a law enforcement response in a school shooting. But history now knows what happened. Ramos entered the school at approximately 11:33 a.m. The first officers arrived within minutes. The response became stalled by failures in leadership, command, communication, tactics, and training. A student called 911 for shots were fired at approximately 12:21 p.m., approximately 75 minutes after the first officers arrived. Officers finally entered room 111. Ramos was killed. The immediate threat ended. 21 people had died. The Department of Justice later called the response a failure. That conclusion cannot change the past, but it can serve as a record of what went wrong. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of Uvalde. When people are trapped inside an active emergency, the responsibility of those outside is not merely to arrive. It is to understand the threat, establish command, communicate clearly, act decisively, and remember why the response exists in the first place. It exists for the people behind the door. In Uvalde, those people were children and teachers. Their lives should remain at the center of the story. Their death should never become merely a statistic. And the 77 minutes should never become merely a number. They should remain a reminder of the cost of delay, the importance of accountability, and the responsibility to learn from a tragedy that can never be undone.